Hello and a warm welcome to the Sex Talk for Men podcast. I'm your host, Linda Connors, a sex hypnotherapist and confidence coach with over 15 years experience working with men who experience sexual problems. In this podcast, we will cover topics such as erectile dysfunction, premature ejaculation, and sexual anxiety, as we explore new ways to overcome these by taking specific steps guided by me. So let's begin. Hello and welcome. I really appreciate you being here today, joining in on this episode. In today's episode, we are going to be diving in to the primal instincts that drive your flight and fight response in sharing these sexual encounters and how this impacts your sexual dysfunction. So this episode is really good to listen to if you experience premature ejaculation, erectile dysfunction, and sexual anxiety. We are going to explore the evolutionary underpinnings of this response and its impact on your arousal, your performance, your pleasure, and enjoyment of sex. So we'll be talking about the fight and flight response versus the sexual arousal response. The main reason I am sharing this work today about the fight and flight response and the impact it has on your sexual function is to give you knowledge. Many of the men who work with me can't understand why they are not able to control their thoughts, anxiety, and what's happening in the body. They think they are doing something wrong. However, if we take away your sense of emotions, your sense of attachment to your performance, any ideas about your masculinity, fears and doubts, if we look at this as a purely physical level, your mind and body are actually responding in the way that is designed to do. And by understanding this, gives you power and helps you to take steps to correct it. At the end of this episode, I'll be talking about that briefly, about some steps that you can take. I'll also talk a little bit about the impact this has on ejaculation, erections, and also sexual anxiety, and the link between your thoughts, your beliefs, your mindset, and the fight and flight response. So just before or during any sexual activity, men may experience a response that may seem similar to the fight and flight response, but it is different. It is called the sexual arousal response. So the sexual arousal response is a physical response that prepares your body for sexual engagement, sexual activity. And while the sexual arousal response may seem similar to the fight and flight response, the purpose and the outcomes are different. So the sexual arousal response in men typically involves the following physical changes in the body and the genital area. There's an increase in blood flow because sexual arousal naturally increases the blood flow to the genital areas, which cause the erection. And also heart rate and blood pressure also begins to increase as the sexual excitement begins to build. And then there's the activation of the sympathetic nervous system, which then releases adrenaline and other stress hormones into the body. And the reason it does this, because this helps sustain sexual arousal and also energy. There's also the muscle tension. So the muscles throughout the body, including the muscles in the pelvic area, may become tense during sex. And this tension is often related to an increase in pleasure and sexual performance. Then there's the increased sensitivity. So sexual arousal often heightens the sensitivity to touch, which then intensifies the overall sexual experience. And it's really important to be aware that the sexual arousal response is a completely natural and normal physical response and process that the body naturally undertakes. And this sexual arousal response has been a part of men since evolution began. It's natural, it's automatic, and the mind, body, and genitals follow their own natural sexual cycle or sexual blueprint. Look at the fight or flight response, which is also known as the acute stress response. Now, the fight or flight response is something that we have inherited from our ancient ancestors, the cave dwellers, etc. This is a physical reaction that occurs when we perceive that we are in threat or in danger. So our ancient ancestors really relied on this response for their survival. In a way, we can look at it as a survival mechanism that prepares the body to either confront the threat, to fight, or to flee from it, flight. And in our modern day life, we may not have those wild animals or other dangerous situations. However, the unconscious mind doesn't know that because that response is so deeply embedded to who we are as human beings. So when you are about to have a sexual encounter or initiate it or beginning to have a sexual encounter, and if you experience premature ejaculation, erectile dysfunction, or sexual anxiety, you may begin to notice that a number of different things happen in the mind and body that are very different to the sexual arousal response that we just went through. Because on a deep unconscious level, you are perceiving the sexual activity as a threat, and your unconscious mind may think this is a physical danger or a stressful situation. So therefore, a number of physical responses and changes take place. And it's really interesting to note that some of these physical changes are also very similar to the sexual arousal response. However, the outcome is very different. There is the activation of the sympathetic nervous system, which is responsible for your fight or flight response. And what happens when this is activated, it releases a surge of energy and adrenaline into your bloodstream, which then prepares you for action, whether that's to fight or to flee the situation. And then it increases your heart rate, causes your heart to beat faster and harder. And then this often leads to more anxiety. And again, this impacts your breathing. Begin to breathe quite rapidly. The breathing becomes faster and more shallow. And rather than having the breath changing its flow on more of a sexual energy flow, this rapid breathing sends a message into the mind, into the brain, that something is about to happen, which then, of course, increases anxiety. A lot of my male clients talk to me about they have a lot of tension in their legs or the lower back, and that the muscles become really tight and uncomfortable. And this is because, when the fight and flight response is activated, the whole body becomes tense because it is preparing and getting ready for action. Remember, in the unconscious mind, it doesn't know that you are in a safe situation with a sexual partner, whether it's a long-term partner, someone that you love and feel safe with, or a new sexual partner that you're beginning to get to know. It's seeing this as a direct threat and danger. Remember, this is all happening in the primal unconscious mind. So when your muscles become tense, especially in the legs or the lower back, it is preparing your body for action, to fight or to flee the situation. Then we move on to the heightened awareness. With the fight and flight response, perhaps you notice that you become hyper alert and more attuned to what's happening in your thoughts and your penis, your genital area. I call this the hyperfocus. So a lot of men focus too much on their performance, what's happening with my penis. Oh my goodness, I'm thinking this thought again. So this hyper alert, this hyper focus is all connected to the fight and flight response. So the primitive unconscious mind is able to easily detect any potential threats. While all this is happening, what then begins to happen is that certain functions in the body begin to shut down because it needs to send energy into the areas of you that are going to help you to survive this perceived threat. So in this fight and flight response, energy is redirected from your non-essential bodily functions. And your primitive mind doesn't know that you're about to engage in sex. So it pulls away the energy from these natural bodily functions to prioritize your immediate survival needs. So here we are looking at ejaculations, erections as well. There's been studies done on, when people are in immediate danger, whether it's a car accident, trauma experience, from being in a holdup in a bank and so on. What happens then is some of these people do wet themselves because they have no control, because the body is redirecting what is important. So their bladder movements, their bowel movements in that moment are not necessary. What is necessary for their survival is. So the energy is refocused to what is most important for their survival. And of course, you are not in those situations. However, once again, your primitive mind does not know that. Now let's talk about PE and the fight and flight response. I'll also be talking about erectile dysfunction and sexual anxiety and the fight and flight response as well shortly. So if you have premature ejaculation, the fight and flight response is most associated with stress and fear. So it indirectly impacts your natural sexual function, including ejaculation. So once again, if you have premature ejaculation and you're about to have sex or you're engaging in sexual activity, you may notice that your muscles become tense, including the pelvic floor muscles, your legs, your lower back. And this tension can lead to heightened arousal, heightened sensitivity, and therefore that reduces your control over ejaculation, which then leads you to ejaculate before you are ready. And if you experience anxiety around ejaculating too quickly, the fight and flight response increases your anxiety and stress because it's causing a surge of adrenaline and other hormones into your body. And these hormones can then lead to heightened sensitivity in your penis area and once again, heightened state of arousal. And the fight and flight response with PE can also cause you to become distracted and hyper-focused on what's happening with your performance. So you're moving your awareness away from pleasure, from fun, from enjoyment, into the fear of ejaculating too quickly, into the high arousal, and into the hypersensitivity. And of course, this fight and flight response often impacts your negative thought and self-doubt, which then puts more pressure and anxiety on yourself. And now let's look at erections and the fight and flight response. So if you have erectile dysfunction when you're about to engage in sexual activity and your body activates the fight and flight response, what begins to happen is as the stress hormones like adrenaline and other hormones are released into the body, and that increases your heart rate, breathing rate, and that begins to divert blood flow away from your non-essential functions. An example of this is digestion and also sexual activity, because it's the fight and flight response most prioritizes your survival over your erections. And then when we're looking at erection strength, the flight or fight response, as I said earlier, blood flow is redirected away from certain areas in your body, including your penis, your genital area. And this redirection can have a negative impact on the blood flow, which then decreases the strength and the quality of your erections. And then adding on top of that is the anxiety, the stress, the overthinking, all contribute to difficulties in achieving and or maintaining your erection. And so now I want to talk about sexual anxiety. And I'm really aware that some of these areas I am repeating things. However, I feel it's really important to separate premature ejaculation, erectile dysfunction, and sexual anxiety out. And this also helps your mind and unconscious mind to be able to receive this knowledge as well on deeper and deeper levels. So, sexual anxiety and the fight and flight response. As I've mentioned earlier, when your body experiences a perceived threat or stress response, the sympathetic nervous system activates the fight and flight response. And this leads to various physical changes in your body, from heart rate, rapid breathing, muscle tension, and heightened awareness. And the fight and flight response in relation to sexual anxiety, this increases stress, nervousness, and anxiety related to your sexual performance and your sexual experiences. So when your body is in this heightened arousal and tension, it can interfere and impact with sexual arousal, desire, and the overall sexual functioning of your body. And perhaps you may notice that during sex or leading up to sex, you may become aware that you have racing thoughts that you cannot control. Again, this is all related to the fight and fight response. Because with the release of the stress hormones like adrenaline and cortisol, this all leads directly to the racing thoughts, most likely due to having these racing thoughts of how to get out of a situation quickly or how to resolve a situation quickly. But in terms of your sexual experiences, your racing thoughts tend to return back to your performance, your fears, and your self-doubts. It's really important to be aware that for most men, the fight or flight response may directly or indirectly impact your sexual function. So it may not be the direct cause, however, it is having an impact and causing the situation to continue more long term. And this fight and flight response is all directly linked to your thoughts, your belief, your mindset. It's kind of interwoven into your sexual blueprint, into your sexual cycle, because this pattern has been repeating for quite a while. So what to do? How do you break out of this fight and flight response? The first step is understanding the impact on the fight and flight response has on you, your body, your genitals, your sexual performance and functions, and your sexual experiences as well. Breath, do some breath work, meditate, and begin to take steps to reduce anxiety. You can refer to my podcast episodes. I have breath work in them, meditations, and steps also to reduce anxiety as well. So understanding the impact of the fight and flight response is a really important step towards achieving a healthy and fulfilling sex life, and the next step towards healing your sexual dysfunction. Now, it's really important to say that if you are experiencing sexual problems, it's always really important to speak to your doctor or your medical practitioner about these, because underlying medical conditions can also cause sexual problems. So here we have looked at the acute stress response, also known as the fight and flight response, the impact this has on your body and your sexual function, and how closely related to your sexual arousal response. And what can happen sometimes when men begin to create changes, begin to heal their sexual dysfunction, and they're having the natural sexual arousal response, they are confused because they're still connecting it to the fight and flight response. So this is why I shared the difference between the sexual arousal response and the fight and flight response. And I always believe that knowledge is power. Understanding what is happening in your mind and body is a gift to you on your journey to take the next steps forward. So thank you for joining me today in this episode. I deeply appreciate you being here, joining with me in this episode. I hope you have enjoyed this free episode. If you would like to work with me more deeply, you're invited to schedule your free initial consultation at sexualsolution.co.uk. The link is in the description. And thank you to the men who have reached out and shared how much this podcast is supporting you to make sexual changes. I wish you all the success on your continued journey. If you have found this episode and podcast to be of benefit, please consider donating so I can keep offering this work. Any amount is appreciated. If you are not in a position to donate, there are other ways to help, from following me in Apple, Spotify, or YouTube, liking or making a comment, and this will help the podcast to reach more men who are seeking to heal and solve their sexual problem. Thank you for being here with me in this space, and I look forward to connecting with you soon. Take care and blessings.